Welcome everyone, and thank you. Oh, there we go. Perfect. That's what we were waiting on. So good morning, everyone. Welcome to Public Policy Charrette number 3 for the Iowa rate making process review. Thank you all for attending both in person and virtually, and looking forward to having some good discussions today. And so we'll move ahead just quickly to kind of go over the agenda for today and how this one-day charrette is going to work. Starting by looking at the schedule for today. The day is split into 2 sessions for the morning and the afternoon. The morning session will be spent discussing any new rate making mechanisms proposed by stakeholders in the pre-charrette written comments, and that discussion will be led by Len. And then I will lead the afternoon discussion on current rate making mechanisms in Iowa legislation and procedures, and any revisions proposed by stakeholders in the pre-charrette written comments for those. And so we move along to just an overview of the charrette, and we'll start with just an overview of the summary. So this summary was prepared based on LEI's interpretation of written comments from the stakeholders. For the persons in the room here, we have a handout just for reference as we continue throughout the discussions today. The mechanisms are simply listed here in alphabetical order, not based on any sort of significance or discussion of order, just as a reference. We have separated each of these topics and mechanisms into the 3 options that were listed on the written comment prompts for the current rate making mechanisms, and then a separate column on the side for any proposed mechanisms from the written comments as well. And then just as a reference as well, the stakeholders included after each mechanism are listed as they were stated in the written comments. This graph here as well, just as a quick reference, was prepared as a visual aid just to note kind of which path stakeholders took when addressing the written comments, whether they leaned more to proposing new rate making components or mechanisms for consideration, or focus more on adjusting and proposing revisions to current rate making mechanisms. This is not a scientific graph by any means, but more just a simple representation of some of the interpretation for the written comments and where each stakeholder stands on recommending new mechanisms versus revising current mechanisms, or if they mention both. All right, and so as noted previously, the purpose of charrette number 3 here is to gather additional feedback from stakeholders on the proposed changes to Iowa's rate making legislation and procedures as listed in the written comments, with the charrette split up into these 2 sessions. Similar to the previous charrettes, the inclusion of mechanisms for discussion does not reflect LEI's recommendations, but are strictly pulled from written comments to gather additional inputs and feedback from the stakeholders. So the typical question framework for each session and to be expected for each mechanism include what authority the IOD would have from any changes, how the current legislation is affected and whether it needs to be revised in light of these proposals, and more specifics on how each proposed mechanism or change would be implemented. And then the agenda of mechanisms for each discussion in the session is included below, with those listed as considered new rate making mechanisms in Iowa versus modifications to current rate making mechanisms. Each of the topics and mechanisms shown in that previous summary slide and included in the handout for the in-person stakeholders were proposed by stakeholders in the written comments, so we'd like to cover everything. We want to discuss all these proposed mechanisms and make sure we give the opportunity to all stakeholders to discuss how they envision any proposed mechanism work. So we'd like to make sure we address everyone's feedback that we received in the written comments. And then we'll just move ahead. Similar to previous charrettes, we'll have the instructions and ground rules for the discussion today. Please raise your hand in the Zoom for virtual participants, or we can turn the name card for those in person if you'd like to participate in the discussion. Please state your name and affiliation when speaking for the first time. Each participant will have up to 4 minutes to share their views. please speak loudly and clearly and answer any specific questions. And then stick to the discussion subjects. As previously shown, we have mostly everything included as on the agenda for today, so we can get to each discussion subject in their relevant sessions. Any questions from any stakeholders before we get started? And all right, and so with that, we'll get into the discussion of new rate making mechanisms, and I will turn it over to Len to lead that discussion for us.
Hi, good morning. So as Donald discussed, we will be discussing 5 new rate making mechanisms that are not currently implemented in Iowa that are proposed, namely IRP, competitive procurement, multi-year rate plan, PBR, and innovative tariff and market-based rates. So we'll start with the IRP. So as pointed out by Donald, multiple stakeholders are supporting the implementation of an IRP. This is to address issues such as the absence of a mandate for utilities to regularly submit comprehensive long-term planning documents and the lack of a proper platform for deliberating the merits of assets and investments. So these stakeholders listed on the slide propose several key components that they want to see in an IRP, and this list is not exhaustive. First, the IRP should be filed with the board in predictable intervals and should be long-term. The board would approve the IRP and would provide guidance as to the minimum criteria for each utility's IRP. The IRP should contain quantitative analysis of all potential options to serve anticipated need. It should also provide several opportunities for robust stakeholder engagements. And as IEA mentioned in the written comments, the resource plan should not be presented piecemeal, but should be viewed holistically and include energy efficiency, demand response as a required component, as well as transmission and distribution planning. The large energy group also states that it should focus on customer costs and seasonal reliability. And I think SEDI and the environmental interveners propose that it could be implemented with an integrated distribution planning. We have listed some questions for our discussion today on IRP, and these are listed on the screen, and I'll just read them through. What authority should the IUP have in the IRP process? For example, in addition to approving the resource plan, are there other mandates that IUP needs to perform? How often should the IRP be refreshed and filed? We read that OCA proposed to have the IRP reviewed at the midpoint of the 5-year energy efficiency plan so as not to overly burden the energy efficiency filings, while the BCE and IEA proposed every 3 years, and IBEC suggests every 3 to 5 years. How long should the IRP planning be? Would 10 years be sufficient, or should it be longer, like 20 years? How involved should the stakeholders be in the IRP process? More specifically, what do you envision their involvement to entail? For instance, would the utility host an official stakeholder process to gather stakeholder inputs, or would stakeholders become interveners in the regulatory review process? What changes would need to be made in the legislation and/or rules to institute an IRP process in Iowa? And lastly, do you agree that the task force should be set up to oversee the IRP design? And if so, who should be included in this task force? So in addition to these questions, feel free to discuss any other components of the IRP that should be included and how the IRP will fit, for example, with the current rate-making mechanisms and procedures. So I'll open the discussion.
So I apologize. I didn't hear what your last question.
So the last question is, do you agree that the task force should be set up to oversee the IRP design.
Is that where we're starting the discussion? That's my question.
Oh,
Oh,
feel
sorry.
free to address any question that's listed here. We just wanted to make sure that all questions were listed so everyone knows kind of what discussion. If you're answering a specific question, please make sure to reference. So for question 1, and then make your statement.
Okay, I'll start at number 6 then,
Good.
because I have an opinion about that. Although I have an opinion about the rest of it too. So my problem with the task force is that it puts off what needs to be done sooner, and we won't have an IRP for however long that task force is in existence. My recommendation is that the legislation that requiring the IRP, that the legislature just say that that the utilities have to have an IRP or a similar planning document that is filed with the board, and let the board go through a rulemaking to develop and allow for stakeholder comment. So I think the legislation should be fairly straightforward and not try to get into all of the details. I don't know about, some people who understand this. I'm not really an expert in this area, but I tried to read Minnesota's and Indiana's, and by the time I got 2/3 of the way through, I don't even know how you implement all of that. And I guess they are, but I just think legislation should be more straightforward, and then let the board open a rulemaking docket. And that's where the discussions about, what are the components and that kind of thing should be. And I'll stop there for now.
Anybody else?
For the Iowa Economic Alliance, Samantha Norris, I agree that with Cecil that a task force is likely going to impede the implementation of an IRP. I agree that it can be accomplished through the legislative process. And then once there is legislation, the rulemaking process can flesh out additional details. I do think that the legislation should be fairly prescriptive. If it is left too general, there likely won't be much clarity for any of the participants. So prescriptive as far as planning period, how often it needs to be refreshed, when it needs to be refreshed, like if something happens, do you need to update your plan? What different scenarios need to be included, what the output needs to be. I think there needs to be good legislative framework around that and not just leave it up to the rulemaking process. Because again, that will delay the implementation. I think the more clear the legislation is, the better it will be for all involved. To the other questions, I think the IUB should be able to approve and or modify the plan. There should be robust stakeholder input and involvement. So discovery, contested case, helping suggest different scenarios or alternatives and being able to run them themselves. As far as timing, I think every 2 to 3 years, it should be refreshed. We don't want it to be too onerous. And I think that's roughly about that midpoint of that 5-year energy efficiency plan cycle that the OCA referred to. I think in our comments, we saw that planning period roughly goes from 10 to 20 years, at least 10. So you have a long-term look, and that will hopefully account for and provide some flexibility to the utilities via different scenarios as well. So it can encompass different future states. And then lastly, as far as what changes would need to be made to legislate, we would need an IRP statute. I think that the energy efficiency statute or pieces of the statute it can be a little tricky to decipher, and it's lengthy and it's kind of all over the place in code. And I think you could maybe simplify that piece of the code as well when you incorporate energy efficiency and demand response into whatever the IRP legislation is. So I think you could simplify the code a little bit as well as some of the processes in front of the board. So maybe you don't have all these different dockets. You might have one comprehensive docket that looks at all the pieces that are currently, as we've said, piecemeal in code.
Thank you. And I see there's somebody who wants to talk online, Jim.
Yes, thank you. Jim Martin Schramm, Clean Energy Districts of Iowa. Andy Johnson, our executive director, can't be with us today. He's traveling. I would like to weigh in on this since it was SETI's recommendation that a task force be appointed. I think the primary focus on that was to make sure that we get this right. An IRP would be a new and significant public policy tool or mandate. It's important that all interested stakeholders have an opportunity to participate in the development of it. At the end of the day, as much as, given how much Iowa legislators have on their plates, the reality is they are not experts when it comes to energy policy. And so it's probably best to, if you go the legislative route, that Cecil suggested, it should be, in our view, a kind of a basic mandate that is left to the Iowa Utilities Board to flesh out through a rulemaking docket, which of course would permit all interested parties to participate and to shape this IRP. The 5-year schedule that OCA has proposed with a 2.5-year, 2 to 3 year refresher, that all makes sense to us. But exactly what would be in an IRP, the outcomes, all of that kind of stuff needs to be fleshed out through a rulemaking docket at the IUB. We're concerned about, certain parties have the resources to draft legislative language and drop it in the laps of legislators. And that kind of language then doesn't have the sort of input and scrutiny that a rulemaking docket offers. So from our perspective, it would be better to have a bare bones legislative proposal or action that is followed by an IUB rulemaking docket. Thank you.
Anybody wants to react to what he said?
I'd like to say something.
Yes, sorry. Dave.
Yeah, my name is Dave Charlone. I'm with Iowa Business Energy Coalition. I agree with a lot of what was said previously. I'd like to tweak it a bit. I do like the idea of something like experts putting together the process. I don't know that I don't know if the legislators have it within them, time-wise and focus-wise to come up with a good IRP plan. But I respect Cecil's concern about the timeliness of it. I mean, whatever is done by focusing experts on developing what this IRP ought to be, I think it ought to have some deadlines on it. With respect to the IRP itself, I think it works better if it has a 20-year lookout. I think a lot of the investments that we're dealing with in Iowa have at least that long of a time horizon on them. And I think it takes that long for those investments to play out. Yeah, sure, the forecasts are going to be a little bit foggy, in years 11 to 20, but they always are anyway, and we ought to at least have plans. As far as the frequency of them, I don't understand what a 5-year schedule with a 2.5-year refresh is. That I'm concerned that these IRPs would be viewed as a discrete event where you finish the IRP and you put it on the shelf and you forget about it. The vision I think makes more sense is that these things are maintained on a 20-year look ahead, and there is a living IRP. It's a living and breathing document, and it's refreshed every 3 years. I think that makes more sense in terms of giving people the ability to see what's ahead when they're doing their long-term planning. I mean, it's all well and good for the utilities to have long-term plans, but if you're in the business of building and growing production facilities in the state, you need to know what you're facing, 5 and 10 years down the road as well before you can make your investments. In terms of what the IUB ought to be, I think it ought to be an IUB sponsored process. I don't know exactly how to say this, but I think the IUB ought to have a role and making sure the process is followed fairly. I had the experience in the state recently where the stakeholder process developed a data set, agreed on what the models ought to be, ran the models with the data, got some answers that made sense, and the utility didn't like them. And the utility hard coded their answers in over top of what the modeling said. And I don't think that's honest to the process. And I think however we structure this, the IUB ought to have the ability to hear complaints when the other stakeholders say, hey, you know, someone was cheating the process, and be able to address that. So I don't know what form that takes in legislation or rules, but I know those are behaviors that I would like the IUB to be able to step in and avoid. And I think it ought to be a process where it's a docketed thing, and you know, the people that participate are invited, and it's something that's serious, and records are kept. So, like I said, I agree with a lot that was said previous, but I would just add those additional tweaks. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, Richard.
Yes, my name is Dick Lozier with the Iowa Business for Clean Energy. The speakers so far have indicated pretty much that they believe that statutory authority is required. And I question that. I think that the board has broad general authority to set rates and to determine the processes for setting rates. So I concur with Cecil with regard to first, no task force. The board has the authority. The board should take the authority and establish a rulemaking proceeding. And the issues that Dave was just talking about are all, to me, they're all encompassed in a rulemaking proceeding. And I think that's the way to go. And Iowa PCE strongly supports the adoption of an IRP, and we encourage the board to proceed along those lines. And I don't believe that statutory authority is necessarily required.
Thank you.
Yeah, Dane Stevens, Mid-American. I think our Charrette number 2 final comments, you know, pretty much speak for themselves, but from Mid-American's perspective, you know, we're obviously in favor of robust generation resource planning. We're in favor of transparency. And we have entered into, you know, a commitment to complete a resource evaluation study as part of our Wind Prime project, and then also an update to that resource evaluation study. And we have laid out in that, in those materials, a lot of specificity about how that would be done, participation from various stakeholders. The end result would be filed with the IUB in an informational filing. There's a provision for the IUB to get involved in disputes over data requests, those kinds of things. So from our perspective, you know, imposing what we think would be a rigid, inflexible, and inefficient top-down kind of IRP requirement would not be a good thing for the state to entertain. We think we should let these, and IPL has a similar obligation in their recent generation advanced rate making principles filing to complete a similar resource evaluation study. But to us, it would make a lot of sense to let those resource evaluation studies play out. That would provide parties a lot of transparency into how the resource planning activities are completed at the 2 different utilities, all those different inputs. And that would really create a lot of information for people to really inform how that would go. Again, more of a, you know, participant-driven process as opposed to a top-down, heavy-handed, inefficient process. So that's the approach we think makes sense. Maybe a wait and see how these resource evaluation studies go before people sort of foreclose or prematurely conclude that something else is required. Thank you.
Thank you. Jenny. Thank you. Jennifer Eastler, Office of Consumer Advocate. I agree with Iowa Business for Clean Energy comments from Mr. Logier, that the board does have authority to order an IRP process. It has indicated that in a number of its orders. I think what they've struggled with is where to do it, how to do it. And the problem that we've experienced over the years is there's not a scheduled timeline for these integrated resource plans to be conducted. And we then just default to when utilities want to update them and present them. And we think that's not a good approach. It should be a periodic review scheduled with broad stakeholder involvement, the ability to issue discovery if needed. And the board is really an integral part of that process. I think the stakeholder efforts have been good, but we really need board leadership. We really need the board to help keep things moving in a good way and to issue guidance along the way. I don't think the answer is a prescriptive legislative approach. I just don't think the legislature is well situated to make very prescriptive decisions on resource planning, and resource planning changes enough over the years. I don't think you want to lock it into place and not have the ability to react as circumstances change. So we had suggested the energy efficiency docket as a place where this could happen. The energy efficiency docket is where all of these parts come together. We're open to other approaches on that if a different rulemaking is available, but the periodic nature of it, make sure it gets done and gives people, the opportunity to participate, and you make sure you have that living type of IRP that a lot of stakeholders, I think, are recommending in this case.
Sorry. Good morning, Debbie Glick from Synapse Energy Economics on behalf of the environmental interveners. Environmental interveners agree that the board does have the authority. However, adding statutory language to provide additional clarity on exactly which elements the board should set rules on, I think would be additionally helpful. For example, logistics, the schedule, there should be statutory requirements from the legislature stating which elements of an IRP and how to design an IRP, where there needs to be guidance. So for example, telling the board that there needs to be clarity on how often the IRP should occur, how often it should be updated, what types of analysis the board should set requirements on. So how many scenarios, what types of modeling tools should be used, how stakeholders should be engaged, what documents should be published. So I think having statutory legislation that tells the board at least which elements need to be clearly defined and set out would provide additional structure and clarity to then the board's rulemaking process. On the point of how long the IRP planning period should be, the robust IRPs I see across the country generally have 2 planning periods. They have a short-term, maybe 5-year planning period where there is more certainty on what resources are available, what will happen, and then longer term, at least 15-year planning periods. At this point, a 10-year planning period is not long enough to get a view on, full resource replacement options, full, with supply chain issues that have been occurring. Sometimes the time length to get a new resource online can be so long that if you have 10 years, you don't even include in that planning period some important new resource decisions. So the IRP planning period should be at least 15 years. With a shorter, maybe 5-year short-term plan as an additional component of the IRP. And there should be clarity on how often they should be refreshed. So I think every 2 years is a good time period, but additionally guidance whenever there are, for example, large federal or state regulations that fundamentally change the IRP process, the board should have the authority and should be required to tell the utilities that they should refresh the IRP based on those changes that have occurred.
Sorry, I didn't introduce myself before. Cecil Wright, I'm just representing myself. So I think the discussion here for me points out the need for legislation. Because I think if you don't have a statute that says that these utilities have to file an IRP with the board, then you end up with a discussion of, well, what does the alternative look like? What are the parameters of it? And then you end up spending a lot of time trying to, some stakeholders trying to get the utilities to do an IRP and follow that process. But they say, no, we're doing this other alternative process. And I think what the legislation would do is they would say, you have to do an IRP, which is a recognized program in the nation with regard to electric utilities. And it lays out the components that you have to put in that IRP. It puts in a time frame for when you file. It talks about, you know, having to provide access to the programs or methodology that's being provided. And if you look at my filing, I attempted to do all of that. I'm not saying it's perfect, but I think it kind of lays out what I see as what a statute would be required or should include, so that then when that comes to the board, they have the outline of what the legislature thinks should happen. And there's not this question about, well, what does this look like? You already said the statute says, no, it has to be an IRP process, not some other process.
Yes, Jeff.
Oh, yeah, Jeff Ripp, Alliant Energy. I'm not going to repeat everything in our comments. Generally agree with what Dane said from mid-AM. You know, we've been submitting IRPs for many years to Iowa. We, as a utility head jurisdiction in Minnesota, we were part of the first processes looking at resource plans. All of that was submitted in information. We did a resource plan very similar to what we've heard discussed today on the process in a voluntary way, where we did bring stakeholders in. We ran additional scenarios beyond scenarios. We all talked about sort of assumptions underlying those. And what we found is, obviously, that's a great process. We like transparency, but it doesn't have to be mandated. I think the challenge with all of that we're hearing here with a legislative, very prescriptive approach is we're setting ourselves up for an awful lot of work. And I would just ask the question, what are the underlying reasons why we're asking for that? Because there's a lot of different opinions around the table of where stakeholders are looking for this information. Ultimately, it's reliability, and it's about the prudency of the investments that the utility is making. You know, our position has been, this is evidence that has been used and will continue to be used in rate making decisions, whether it's advanced rate making or rate cases that we file at the utility. It's on us as a utility to make smart, prudent planning decisions, and we do want to be transparent with stakeholders and bring them in, but that process is not necessarily rigid and prescriptive. So the flexibility to adapt to changing, whether it's changing resource adequacy requirements, changing technology requirements, there's a lot in flux in the industry right now, and I'm concerned that if we lock in a process that's too prescriptive, the information we get will not be useful. We'll end up with more work. Ultimately.
Laura. Hi, Lori Williams. I'm an attorney with Sierra Club. I think the utilities should be doing more work. And I think that when you're talking about multi-billion-dollar investments that are going to be impacting our future for the next 20 years or much longer, that's a lot of work that the board should be very involved in and should have a seat at the table for, and should be reviewing the reasonableness of the planning process that the utilities are undertaking. I think the Minnesota statute is broad enough to lay out some clear guidance on how the process should look without being overly prescriptive. And then the regulations that Minnesota developed were much more prescriptive. It says, the Minnesota law says that the board or the commission shall approve, disapprove, or modify the proposed resource plan. And that lays out the standard that the board, it indicates the legislature wants the regulator to actually review the reasonableness of the IRP analysis. And I think that is a critical component of what IRPs.
Thank you. Yes.
Aurelian Windenberger with ISETA. I had a question actually for the utilities, in terms of when you're doing your own internal resource evaluation studies, do you have any timeline in terms of how often you recommend doing those internally and bringing in outside stakeholders?
So, no, not necessarily, but we do have continuous planning processes. So we're always planning, looking at changes. We've been in Iowa in particular, we have been in contested case process for the last 2 years, which that in and of itself tends to maybe hinder a little bit of the stakeholder engagement on planning processes. So I think that's one of the challenges we have is a contested case essentially freezes the ability to be flexible with that kind of a process where you have sort of evidentiary with approval at the end of it. So that's why we don't support sort of a contested case or mandatory IRP approach. I think we can be a lot more flexible in a non-contested case.
Yeah, for Mid-America, I think we would agree. We were continuously doing generation resource planning, always looking at improvements to the modeling techniques and modeling assumptions, updating information that goes into that. And I guess I would agree with Jeff that in a contested type proceeding, it's just very cumbersome. It's very tedious and burdensome on everyone involved. You know, I think that does hinder a lot of the participation, you know, that folks would be hoping to get out of that type of process. And as for time horizon, you know, we're always looking out 20 to 25 years. But this probably goes without saying, but a resource plan isn't done and that's your recipe for the next 20 years. That's not how it goes. You do a resource plan, it's indicative. There's the kinds of things that, what the kinds of resources that would be needed as everything changes, as you know, loads change, as retirements of resources are expected to occur, all those kinds of things. And so really your focus is normally in the first several years, 5 years, something like that of the plan. But again, it's not a set it and forget it kind of a thing. You're continually looking at that, those kinds of plans.
As to the question of do we need legislation, does the board have authority? I think even if the board does, and I think the board has tried to exercise that authority at different dockets that address different pieces of what would be in an integrated resource plan. And typically it's resisted. Well, this isn't specifically required by statute, right? Or it's outside the scope of this proceeding. Or when it is ordered, it's not provided. And so even if the board has tried to exercise the authority, I don't think that authority has been respected. I don't think that it has provided the results that the board has tried to get at in the past. And so if we want as a state to ensure that we do have transparency and that there is a plan that encompasses the state's energy policy, right, as far as reliability, affordability, safe service, all of those things, a balanced portfolio, promoting the development of renewable energy. We need something that is a specific mandate from our elected officials, that this is the policy of the state, that we will engage in this process. Stakeholders will have a seat and that the electric investor and utilities will perform it.
Yes, Lauren.
I have 2 questions. The first is for Mr. Stevens. Who mentioned, oh, sorry, Lori Williams.
Lori, go ahead.
Lori Williams on behalf of Sierra Club. I have 2 questions. The first is for Mr. Stevens. You mentioned that you all are constantly updating your resource planning analysis. And I was wondering if you would be willing to submit, say, your last IRP type modeling analyses into this record so that the facilitators could see that. I'm not sure the stakeholders have seen that. And then the second question is whether IPL and Mid-American, would you be open to inviting stakeholders who have demonstrated interest in the resource planning processes? Say the solar industry group, for just as an example, who haven't settled your recent cases, would you invite them into your planning processes?
I'm not gonna make a commitment on who we will or won't invite. I mean, if we have an open order from the board here that can address that. Generally speaking, we're concerned about our customers, affordability, key stakeholders that represent our customers. I think obviously there's lots of people that would be interested in resource plans across the country for utilities. I would need to understand for any stakeholder to participate sort of what their level of interest is in our utility in particular, and in how we serve our customers affordably and reliability. Because that's what this is about, really, is how do we serve customers in Iowa. As you know, resource plans do contain proprietary financial information of the utility that could be competitive to the extent that the solar industry would compete with utilities. That would give me some pause of concern, frankly. But not to say there isn't a way to bring people in that are interested, but I think we need to demonstrate that they're interested in the case.
So just real quick in response to I never said that Mid-American completes quote IRPs. So I feel like I'm being cross-examined here on the understand or something. I never said we've completed IRPs. I said we continuously do resource planning. So in our energy efficiency filings, we submit that resource plan. So we recently submitted that. That was in the energy efficiency plan. That was recently, it was recently, I guess, a proposed decision order came out here recently on that. And in our prime proceeding, we provide a lot of information about our resource planning as well. Those materials are all publicly available.
Benjamin.
Ben Flickinger with the Large Energy Group. I guess we would just kind of tack on to what everyone else has been saying, especially like going to OCA and Mr. Legiere's points that, the board has the authority. I think they currently do right now, but the fact that virtually every customer focus group that's participating in this docket is asking for an IRP shows that the authority alone is not enough. There probably is some legislation needed to kind of force everyone's hand on this. I understand the utilities, the rate regulated utilities think this may be burdensome, but when they're asking for multi-billion-dollar investments going forward for 30, 40 years out, I think the fact that customers want the input and want to see what their planning is before spending that money is probably a telltale in and of itself. Why legislation should be probably necessary in this case.
Yes.
Hi, yes, Debbie Glick at Synapse Energy Economics. I want to respond to a few things that have been said. So I've heard the mention of a rigid and burdensome process, and I agree we don't want a rigid and burdensome process. A poorly designed process can be rigid and burdensome. That's why we're having these conversations. That's why we're talking about clear legislative language and clear board rules, so that a process is designed that is not overly rigid, but just requires the utilities to do what is reasonable and prudent. If an IRP isn't, I understand the utilities don't want to do unnecessary work, but what they're doing right now is not necessarily sufficient. So an IRP should not just be about laying out a baseline scenario and maybe one sensitivity. It needs to be about understanding how robust your current resource plan is to changes and what other reasonable resource plans would look like. So more work very likely involves doing what should be done, what needs to be done to design a robust and resilient resource plan. And I think some of the back and forth that I just heard between Mid-American and Sierra Club's attorney is part of the problem. There shouldn't be contention around what the resource plan is, around sharing this information. There shouldn't be fighting. This information should be public. Resource planning should be public. That is what happens in many other states. I've done resource planning documents in many states across the country. And it's not, I tell many of the utilities in other states I work in that there are states where there is no resource planning publicly published, they'd be pretty surprised. I think legislative guidance that clearly lays out what needs to happen and board rules can balance the concerns utilities have for overly rigid, while also laying out what clearly needs to happen, what analysis clearly needs to be done to design a robust, resilient, low-cost system going forward.
Yes.
So I just wanted to come back to the issue that was raised about looking at the IRP in a contested case. And I'm not convinced that that is beneficial, and I don't have a final recommendation on that. What I think this process is, and I think it's been explained by some of the other stakeholders, is we want an open, there should be an open process that everyone gets to see what the planning is and to offer, to ask questions, to offer different proposals, and to do that on a regular basis. And that's why you need an IRP. You need a structure so that that is filed with the board opens the docket, and that everyone gets a chance to see what the planning process is, and then it gets to comment on it or propose alternatives. The contested case for me would occur whenever the utility wants to bring whatever their decision is to the board and ask for the ratepayers to pay for it. But if you have this history or this information through the IRP process about what supports that decision, I think you have a better product or a better contested case at that point than you would have if you had a contested case on the IRP itself. So that's
Matt.
Matt Soden with Lion Energy. So again, we performed an integrated resource plan. Stakeholders participated. It used 9 scenarios, stakeholder suggested scenarios. There was vast participation in the process. It took over a year. I haven't heard any specific problems with what happened or why people didn't like it. But what this is a resource plan is developing evidence for a contested case proceeding where the utility is going to be asking for something, making a specific ask. I mean, stakeholders who are asking for another contested case to even decide how to develop the evidence for a future contested case is asking for more than one bite of the apple. And I believe that we need to be careful of gumming up the processes and not allowing a utility who has the obligation to reliably serve customers and the obligation to provide service, the ability to do so. The more barriers we put in place that do not allow us to provide service to our customers, it makes our jobs harder. And then again, we're the ones who are ultimately held responsible for not being able to provide that service in a reliable fashion.
Thank you. Carrie?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, Matt pointed out that these processes, utilities have gone through them. They're apparently not overly burdensome to go through. So we think opening that up to more people, making it more transparent, making it clear that that's an expected baseline for an investor-owned utility in Iowa. That seems like I'm hearing everyone's on board with that. I'm just kidding. explain, but it does sound like that's something that's doable. We've done it, we're doing it in some other places, so why not put the best practices, the bare minimum into law? The other piece I wanted to address is just the idea that this creates something new that would be, adding, where I think that there's an opportunity to streamline other things in the process. And so if some dockets were, if we were able to do some of the analysis, say on like the energy efficiency pieces in the IRP, or the emission plan and budget dockets, those kinds of modifications would be rolled into an IRP analysis. The processes for advanced rate making could also be simplified to some extent if you had an evidentiary record that was largely created through the IRPs. That could help out too. So it's not necessarily that it's just something extra that the utilities have to do that doesn't provide any value along the way or doesn't streamline other processes, because there are a number of dockets we talked about that are piecemeal that we could look at. How do we do that all in one place instead of doing all of these other dockets one at a time?
Jennifer.
Thank you. So I think what the past processes, I don't want to be overly critical of efforts to engage stakeholders in the resource planning process, and IPL definitely has done that. I think we've been coming up with workarounds for the lack of a clear periodic planning process, and that was one workaround. I mean, I think the problem is you're doing it at one point in time, and then things change dramatically. The pandemic, the supply chain, the solar tariffs, the IRA, all of which kind of necessitated a refreshing of things, and we don't have a process in place to do that refreshing. And likewise, when you're looking at one decision, say the early termination of the Joint Arnold contract, I think it'd be good to know what your plans are down the road so we can make an informed decision about that decision. And we don't have that complete picture when we're looking at proposals. And I think having that complete picture, timely updated, refreshed with stakeholder input is really what we're in need of, and what would better assure that we're coming up with a reasonable plan that meets customers' needs and hopefully a lowest cost reasonable manner. I think the board is best situated to take this opportunity to put that policy in place and address the stakeholder views that we're hearing in a process that works for stakeholders. I think looking for the legislature to do this, it's not easy for everybody to participate at the legislature. And I think, what we benefit from here today is an understanding of what everybody's looking for in this process, and making sure you're coming up with a process that meets those needs and can be adapted to changing circumstances. So we continue to see the board leadership on this in a rulemaking or energy efficiency dockets as our best opportunity to do so, and we don't need to wait. We can do that right away.
Thank you.
I have a question on Cecil, and as I understood what you were saying was that you have a non-contested docket where the company kind of showed their plan of what it is. Other parties could publicly stake out their positions in regard to it, or offer suggestions or criticisms or whatever. What would the board's role in that particular proceeding? So I think primarily it would be to make sure that the process is transparent, that all the information is exchanged, and then the board, collects that information and reviews it, because ultimately the utilities are gonna ask for whatever their decision is, whatever is decided to be put into rates. And it's just all that information is then available to be able to look at in the contested case where those are proposed to put into rates and decide, maybe the utility, I don't know, ignored everybody and just went on their own way. Well, that's a piece of evidence. Maybe they've tried to accommodate everybody, and maybe by the time they get there, everybody agrees that the decision was the appropriate decision based upon the information that's been provided. I guess my thought is that for me, the goal is transparency and letting everyone have a say about how the utility is going about providing safe and adequate service at just and reasonable rates. And that's what I see the goal of an IRP is. Board approval adds another layer to it, which, if that's what the legislature or what the board thinks it should be, I'm okay with that. I just don't think that's the goal, because I think that does lock in what's being proposed. And I do understand the comments from the utilities about flexibility. And so that's why you have an open process, and they have to file, and they file their changes every year. And, it just keeps everything up to date, and everybody has this. And I think, if you look at the most recent filings, advanced rate making, the recent rate cases, I mean, it just shows you need some transparency about what is being proposed to provide safe and adequate service to the customers. And are those the best decisions? And you shouldn't have to wait till a rate case or an advanced rate making proceeding to review that or to see the background.
Aurelian Windenberger with ISETA. For me, it's, I'm a little bit newer to this whole process than most of you. And so it's been interesting just picking up, learning about all the different opinions and thoughts on this. And I think, from my perspective, it seems like, with the current process, with, the contested cases, a lot of work has to be done after the fact, after the utilities come up with their work up front, and then the parties that are contesting it come in and ask for more information. And so I think, I completely understand the utilities' concern about extra work. But it seems like, kind of to Carrie's point a little bit, we would be shifting some of that work to, maybe working a little bit more collaboratively up front versus, in a more adversarial fashion after the fact. So, I think for that reason, that's another reason that I said I would support that IRP process.
Anybody else? Next, Lori.
Hey, Lori from Sierra Club. I just wanted there's a lot of talk about contested cases versus not contested cases. I just wanted to throw out there that in Minnesota, it's actually not a contested case. There is board or commission oversight of the discovery process. Like if there's a discovery dispute, which almost never happens in Minnesota because it's a very broad and open process. Basically the transparency of the discovery process lets different parties test the reasonableness of the utilities planning process, and then they can file comments. And then the regulator has the ability to say, okay, was the utilities process reasonable or not based on various parties' comments? And then they issue their final findings of fact. And it's not rigid in the sense that, if the utility then comes forward with a different resource proposal, they can just explain why it's a different resource proposal. So it's not binding and rigid in that fashion. So I think there's a way to do it in a way that preserves lots of flexibility for change circumstances.
I'm sorry.
Yes, I'm Dick Lozier with Iowa Business for Clean Energy. I appreciate this good discussion that we've had, and I think that it comes down to a question of how do we start? And basically, I see the issues whether we wait for the legislature to authorize the board to do something, or whether the board takes the initiative and begins a rulemaking on these issues. And for me, I would prefer that the board take the initiative and go ahead and get started with it. And if the legislature wants to come along with some legislation to authorize what we're doing, that's that. But I would not wait for the legislature. There are a lot of details to be worked out in this, in all of this. We've talked about it, you know, how long, how frequently does it get refreshed and so on. And all of those things are important issues, and they can be worked out through the rulemaking proceeding. And that's, I see that as beyond the scope of what we're doing here today, but I appreciate the comments. Thank you.
Thank you.
Dane Stevens, Mid-American. I guess just maybe my final set of comments would just be, just again, encourage people to look at our Charrette number 2 comments. Some of the states have been held up in high regard. Our comments show that they have the highest rates in all the Midwest. They also show that they've achieved much less progress on the renewable transition than Iowa. I think we also have shown that in terms of economic growth, those states are doing much, much worse than Iowa is. So I would just say, you know, again, that I think Iowa's process has been working quite well. It's gotten us very, very far to where we are today. And I just think there's a risk of experiencing bad outcomes of going down the other approach.
Is there anything?
I had a question to follow up on that Iowa Business for Clean Energy. What, I guess, under what authority or what chapter would that rulemaking occur? Would it be a new chapter? Would it be an existing one? How would that, how do you envision that playing out so that we can kind of better contextualize what you're recommending?
Well, the board has broad general authority to regulate rates. And the board with that authority can initiate a rulemaking. That's how I see it.
I guess I'm wondering, would it be within the energy efficiency procedures chapter, a rate making chapter, a separate new chapter related to generation? Would it be in that chapter? I'm trying to understand where it would fit within the existing rules.
I'll get back to you on that.
Fair enough.
I don't have the code with me today, Samantha, but yeah, I mean, it would have to be done right, but I think there's a way to do
it.
I'll make one more comment in response to Sam's question. I think it will probably be a new chapter, which not only includes an IRP for electric utilities, but also needs to require some kind of planning document from both the gas and the water and the sanitary sewer and all of those. I think it's something that whose time has come. And, you know, Dick may be right. It may be more efficient to do that from the board as a rulemaker, but I think it really will probably need to be a different chapter that applies to all the regulated utilities.
Excuse me, Cecil, when you say a new chapter, do you mean a statutory or regulatory?
No, in the
Rule.
I guess just to respond to that, I think we've filed comments and addressed this previously, but would just note that I would respectfully disagree with Mr. Wright on that. You know, natural gas service, which we're natural gas only at Black Hills Energy, is quite different from a resource planning perspective of what we've had, you know, discussion here today. In Iowa, we are natural gas only, so we're a single fuel source. It's not solar, it's not natural gas generation, not coal, not wind, and how you combine that and provide it. It is natural gas only. We primarily are served off of one single interstate pipeline, which is regulated by FERC. And so really the resource planning that we're talking about, the processes are completely different from an electric advanced rate making standpoint versus a smaller natural gas utility with a basic single fuel source with no advanced rate making capabilities ourselves, much smaller investments, much more regulated from a PHMSA safety standpoint. So I think the needs that I've been hearing from others, just listening to the conversation today, I don't think that they apply the same from an electric standpoint to a natural gas standpoint, and putting a singular process doesn't necessarily, in my opinion, make sense to apply that from a natural gas only perspective. Would respectfully disagree with Mr. Wright on that.
Yes,
Rachel Niemeyer with Iowa American Water Company. Similar to Black Hills, we've put in our comments how water is different in terms of resource planning, and if such mechanism or requirement is included for water, it should be related to a mechanism where we can provide information for future growth and investment. And that's the way we're doing this is very different. Water service is very different from the electric service that we've been discussing all morning. So I would just note that and ask that you please look at our comments for support of why it's different for water and wastewater than electrics.
Rachel, would it be something different than your capacity development planning that you already assume have? Would that meet the need?
I think we can kind of work through that. What we kind of envisioned and put in our comments is, a mechanism that kind of we plan out for a certain number of years, and then it's not a forecast like it's been discussed, but then the board knows what we're doing, and the parties know what the plan is, and then there's a reconciliation piece of that too. But it's a different than what the electrics have to face.
Yeah, in our comments, we basically use the example from Indiana American where they propose a plan that gets approved, and then we can come in and petition for rate relief. So it's a two-step process, and then, parties can participate, and that's what we propose for water. It would make sense, especially tied to safety, environmental.
Sorry.
I don't want to repeat it, Alliant Energy, we do have gas customers as well, and we do not neglect those customers, but we would agree with the comments from Black Hills and American Water on the difference between the service industries, and a resource plan, integrated resource plan we've been talking about really is in the electric industry focused topic. And the planning and the requirements for the other utilities should be different.
Thank you, Carrie.
Yeah, I think that's probably right, that the planning would look different because the systems are really different. But I do think the idea of having a stakeholder input and transparency when we're talking about gas systems and water systems too, but is really beneficial, especially given the kinds of incentives available now that are, seeing people perhaps move away from gas to some extent, and the infrastructure that is still required to serve reliably and to provide safety, et cetera. Those questions are going to become more and more important about who pays for that, how much does it cost, and how are the systems the right size for the service that they're providing. And so I think we're going to see more of those conversations happen in Iowa. So I don't want to neglect that as like, hey, this is going to become an issue that we're going to need to talk about. And so it's probably worth at least putting a pin in how do we think about how we deal with those conversations and stakeholder input and costs and all those questions going forward.
Thank you. There's nothing else, we can move on to the next topic, competitive procurement. So several stakeholders, mainly said the BCE, EI, IEA, and LEG discussed the importance of having a competitive procurement process with the IRP. These benefits include ensuring ratepayers are getting reliable and secure energy at the lowest cost, and transparency of securing the resources, and allowing for rigorous assessment of project feasibility. So the BCE and SEDI proposed that the utilities resource portfolio should be developed using capacity expansion models to find the least cost set of resources, and that procurement would be all source and technology neutral to ensure ratepayers are getting reliable and secure energy at the lowest cost. And BCE specifically recommends hiring an unbiased, independent, third-party evaluator who would review the procurement process, bids, and results. So for our discussion, our questions are, what changes would need to be made in the legislation and or rules to establish a competitive procurement process? What would be IUB's role in this competitive procurement process? For example, does the commission need to approve the request for proposals or the RFP before the utility can issue it to the bidders? Also, will the commission need to acknowledge a utility's final shortlist of bids? Third, should there be any criteria tied to competitive procurement? So for instance, should the competitive procurement process only be triggered if the rate-regulated utility seeks to procure resources over a certain capacity or megawatt threshold? What do you envision stakeholder involvement to entail? Would they be more like interveners in the competitive procurement process? And lastly, do you agree that an independent third-party evaluator or monitor be hired to oversee the process? And who would pay for the evaluator's professional fees? Also, would an independent third-party evaluator be only hired under certain circumstances or in all the competitive procurement events? So I might want to direct the question to, I guess, the BCE and SEDI, who propose some very specific components for the competitive procurement process. Yes.
Bob Rafferty with Iowa Business for Clean Energy. First off, while we pose some specifics in a lot of ways where we think the concept's more important and open to kind of a process being developed that really has kind of more expert opinion helping to develop this. The reality is we have a monopoly system for our electric utilities. But we all know that a market-based competitive system is always healthy. It produces better results for the customer in the long run. This is ensuring a competitive procurement process starts putting some of the benefits of that market rate, the competition of the market into this system that it currently lacks today. That's number one. Number two, when we talk about all source technology, and here's a good example of this would really require some thoughtful process of how to design this, because in many ways you do want to make sure it's a technology neutral approach, but at the same time you want to ensure balance. For example, if solar is the low cost and is always going to win out, or wind, or whatever it may be, I think everybody agrees you don't want your energy sources, all your eggs in one basket. So while we suggest a technology neutral approach, that's not with total blinders on. And then third, as far as an independent third party evaluator, this occurs in other states. And by the way, competitive procurement is a very common practice in many states. And in a number of those states, they do use an independent third-party evaluator in that process. Because any competitive procurement that's just managed by one party with a with a vested interest, that can be pretty well influenced. So I think ensuring an independent third party ensures that the ratepayers have the best interests in mind. So we would encourage really that this become an important part of the process that comes out of IRP process. Thank you.
Yes, Dave.
May I say something?
Yes, of course.
I'm David Charlone. I'm with the Iowa Business Energy Coalition. I think earlier I demonstrated that we think IRPs are very good thing. I also believe that competitive procurement of the base assets is a good thing as well. But I think it's bad to link these two things together. I think it would unnecessarily complicate the process of coming up with a good IRP. I also think it would bog down the competitive procurement process of whatever eventual assets that you're going to want to get as a result of the IRP. I also think trying to link them together would slow down and delay the process of defining, how we want to work those two processes in Iowa. I think we're better off leaving them separate and let them run on their own tracks. I think it's easier to accelerate the development of an IRP process quickly than it is to lay out the rules for a competitive process for the acquisition of new assets. Two good ideas, but together they don't work well together. I think if you do, you risk coming up with solutions that would be suboptimal. Thanks.
Thank you. Yes, Jim. Jim?
Yes, sorry, thank you. I had to get off mute. Jim Martin Schramm, SETI, Clean Energy Districts of Iowa. I think Dave makes a valid point there. IRPs have probably in the shortest term a 5-year planning horizon, and in the longer term a 20-year planning horizon. It's one thing to evaluate technologies. It's another thing to figure out when you want to invest in a particular technology, how to do so in the most cost-efficient manner. And so, excuse me, I think Dave's right that it's not necessarily the case that these two things have to be yoked together in an IRP, but competitive procurement and a process to ensure that the RFPs for that procurement are in fact robust and have appropriate timelines, etc. That sort of process or those criteria for what constitutes competitive procurement needs to be developed more carefully and fully and consistently than what we've seen in recent dockets before the board. So I think we agree with Dave that these are both good ideas, but they don't necessarily have to be yoked together.
Ben Flickinger with Large Energy Group. I would agree with the last two commenters. We talked about competitive bidding more in terms of the advanced rate making context than the integrated resource plan. Currently, the advanced rate making statute requires comparisons with other feasible alternatives, and competitive bidding would be one way to show that comparison and ensure that customers are being asked to pay for prudent and reasonable costs. And so we still agree with integrated resource planning, but I think they are two separate things.
Yes, sir.
Good morning. I'm Bob Bird with the Iowa Senate Republican Caucus staff, and got a question about Yes. Until around 2001, the code embodied, I think, a least cost standard. It was a part of chapter 476A, maybe certification requirement for significant electric generation facilities. That was, I think, repealed around the same time as the advanced rate making statute was enacted. Since that time, has the board ever disallowed a proposed investment, capital investment, as imprudent, or has it ever in a final decision in a rate making docket, advanced rate making docket, disallowed a proposed advanced rate making? I'm not talking about rate of return, but has the board ever found something imprudent in the last 22 years? And if this is a question that's not fair to ask now, factual question, I appreciate feedback at a later time. Thank you.
Cecil, do you have the answer to that? You know, I don't know that they have ever found an advanced rate making docket the proposal imprudent. I know that in one instance, they approved advanced rate making principles that the utility found were unacceptable. And so the utility did not go ahead with the generation construction. So that's the only one I know. I'd have to think about what they have found individual advanced rate making principles either imprudent or not reasonable, but I don't know that they've ever found the actual facility itself improved.
There was one with where there was an exceedance of the cost cap. They ruled that spend, I think, was not.
Yeah, but that's
different.
That advanced rate one principle. Yeah.
Yes, Dave?
Yeah, just to answer that question, Alliant did have an advanced rate making project in which they found that they had gone over the cost cap that was approved in advanced rate making. They did not disallow them to recover those costs. They just indicated they would recover the cost of that without a return on it. So, I mean, that's the only other one that I know of in which there was an issue with advanced rate making. And as Cecil mentioned, there was a coal plant that Alliant had received advanced rate making, and then they saw substantial increases in the cost of that coal plant, and then they declined to accept the advanced rate making on that to build that plant.
Thank you. Jim?
Yes, thank you. Jim Martin Schramm again from Clean Energy Districts of Iowa. With regard to competitive procurement and least cost resource, I think, you know, the name of our organization is the Clean Energy Districts of Iowa. So while we certainly want to see competitive procurement and we want procurement at the lowest cost, that's also within Iowa's current prioritization for low carbon resources and the promotion of renewable energy. So I want to be sure that that caveat is introduced into this discussion. We certainly would not be in favor of, you know, mothballed coal plants being resurrected or an explosion of petroleum-based generators cranking out juice. That's not what we're interested in. We think competitive procurement also includes the acquisition of energy and capacity through power purchase agreements rather than through direct ownership of those assets by the utilities. We think in many cases, ratepayers will come out ahead. And so that's kind of what we have in mind here. We're not particularly interested in ending up with a resurrection of fossil fuel-based power generating sources.
Thank you. Yes, Bob.
Yeah, Bob Rafferty. And I thought I'd clarify perhaps my earlier comments because I think I conveyed something I didn't intend to. We do agree that IRP process and competitive procurement should be separate. I guess my intention was just merely to say that we believe an IRP process would ideally inform what type of assets you intend to procure in the future, and then that should go through a competitive procurement process. Thank you.
Anybody else? Yes.
Dane Stevens, Mid-American. I think maybe said this the last charrette, but just when it comes, to power purchase arrangements, I think we've identified in the past, charrette, that there's some risks to that, and some benefits to utility-owned resources. The risks, of course, would be, can the counterparty, perform the contract over the long term, despite your best efforts to layer in the kinds of protection that you need. We laid out that one of our first wind farm experiences was a power purchase arrangement from the entity that got acquired by Enron. We all know what happened to them. And that was a very prolonged proceeding that we had to go through as part of that effort. So there's certainly risks that are there. And then in terms of the benefits to utility ownership, we have a strong preference for utility ownership. Number one, it keeps with the utility all of the flexibility that can possibly be had with respect to that project. So for example, in the interconnection world, transmission interconnection is a very valuable commodity these days. And if you have a transmission interconnection, the party that owns the interconnect gets certain rights. So rights such as repowering, rights such as repurposing the interconnection at the retirement of a resource, rights such as supplemental interconnection or dual purpose interconnection. And when you have arrangements where it's a third party, it's very difficult for the utility on the front end to sort of think about every one of the possible uses that the utility might have over the next 20 or 30 or 40 years. So whereas when the utility owns that asset and it owns the interconnection, it gets all of those rights. And by it's really our customers get all of that flexibility to repurpose that interconnection and utilize that interconnection in different ways over the long term. So again, we have a very strong preference to the utility ownership model.
Anybody else in competitive procurement? None. I think we can take a 15-minute break.